So can we start with some basic information? Your name, your date, your place of birth, and your current status, please.
Carolyn Durham. I was born in Plainview, Nebraska, but I never lived in Nebraska. And I am currently retired professor of French and comparative literature.
And
Did I miss something?
Yeah, can you just tell me your date of birth? I know we should never ask.
February 13th, 1947.
Okay, no problem. It's just useful to situate how old you were in 68. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, your education, your upbringing, that sort of thing?
Well, we moved around a lot, so that I went to 13 schools before I went to high school. So I sort of have no sense of home. But I went to college in Boston at Wellesley and did my graduate work in Chicago at the University of Chicago, and then taught in Ohio for 38 years and am now retired to North Carolina.
And in your family and your upbringing, was politics an important feature, or was it something that wasn't discussed?
My dad was a World War II vet and never talked about it, except that he remembered France very fondly. And during the Vietnam War, which will get us shortly to the area we're talking about, we had bitter struggles in the family. I mean, he and I our tempers ignited at the same time. And a World War II vet and a student in 68 were on opposite sides of Vietnam.
Yes, indeed, I can imagine. So what brought you to France in 1968?
I was a junior at Wellesley, and I spent my junior year abroad with the Sweetbriar Junior Year in France program. And
were you studying at college there, basically?
Yes, I was. I was in Tours for 6 weeks, and then in Paris from early October until June of 68. So I was in France from late August 1967 until late July 1968, and. Okay. In Paris, I took courses at the Sorbonne, at what was then the Sorbonne, and at the Institut Catholique, I took a course, and I took a course at Sciences Po.
Okay, very good. And what did you make of the university system in France?
Well, see, I just thought that was France, so I didn't, I thought the fact that there were these huge amphitheaters and the professor walked in and delivered a lecture in which people frantically raced to take notes, and particularly for an American student because they didn't hand out a syllabus and there was no bibliography. I just thought, isn't that great? This is France. I was very intrigued by the differences and, enchanted with everything French at the time. So at the time I didn't think about it. I thought, okay, this is how things are. Now, to be fair, Sweetbriar had set up ways to help us with our courses at the Sorbonne. So we had study groups. And
had you been to France before?
I had never been to France before.
Okay, so this is your first experience?
Oh, it's absolutely, yeah. I was taking pictures of French cows when I first arrived, and then thinking, wait a minute, these cows look just like Wisconsin. I'm thinking, oh, a French cow. Just to give you a sense of the naive 20-year-old.
Yeah. And what were your living conditions there? Where were you staying?
I'm assuming you're only interested in Paris. And in Tours, we lived with families for 6 weeks. In Paris, I lived with a recent widow and her 2 children, though her young son was at Saint-Cyr. Her husband had died just a year before. He was in Algeria with de Gaulle. He was an army officer. And so I lived, and they were also ancienne noblesse. So I lived with the Comtesse de Hautefort, who was a lovely, lovely, lovely woman, but a strongly Gaullist family. And that eventually, as you can imagine, affected what I did in the spring of 68.
I'm sure it did. So
I lived in an apartment in the 8th arrondissement.
Okay, cool. And prior to the events of 1968, would you describe yourself as politically active? Were you involved in?
No, not at all. Not at all. Until that year, not at all.
Okay, so you hadn't been involved.
That year was interesting for a student because my first awareness of politics was in France, but it was about objections to American imperialism, to the fact that Americans were not beloved, to the fact that at home students were protesting the Vietnam War, so that, yes, I was becoming politically active, but not in a specifically French way.
Okay. And can you recall having any feeling that something was about to kick off, or did what happened come as a total surprise?
No, in fact, I was on my way to a class at the Sorbonne when there was this odd smell in the air, and I eventually realized I was smelling tear gas for the first time. So no, I was not aware. Having said that, because the Sorbonne was later, I mean, we knew about Nanterre. We certainly knew about Combendit. I mean, I was reading all of that. I think at the time there was we were certainly told by Sweetbriar to try to not be involved, to not get arrested, to not go to, so that it's not that I didn't know about it, but I was not actively involved. And then when things got worse, I was living with a very Gaullist family. I liked her a lot. There was an even stronger sense of don't do anything to embarrass the family.
Oh, that's interesting. And did you mentioned earlier there, even from your own perspective, that there might have been some sort of generational conflict between yourself and your father, or differences, let's say. Was there any sense of this generational change going on at the time? And when I refer to that, I don't just mean politically, but also in terms of culture, fashion, music, those sorts of things?
It was the 60s. Yeah, I think there's no doubt that we had our own culture, our own youth culture, our own music. I think that's true. I don't think it was specifically French. I mean, I think that the pull was really strong too in terms of what was, you know, two of my strongest memories from that spring are the assassination of Martin Luther King and then in June, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So it was, there was a pull between what was going on in the United States and what was going on in France.
And when you were in France, was there a strong recognition of international issues?
Of international issues, well, certainly Vietnam was other than that, and obviously the assassinations were and the political situation of the U.S. But other than that, France was very focused on France, understandably, particularly beginning in March of '68.
And as an American, did you feel uncomfortable given the feelings around Vietnam?
Oh, I quite understood the feelings around Vietnam at the time. So no, I didn't.
Target for criticism or anything like that. You know, some people have said that they felt as though, as an American, they were, you know, maybe felt a little bit uncomfortable.
I don't remember feeling uncomfortable as an American. Yeah, I had gone to France with the idea that I was going to totally immerse myself, which I did, that I was going to speak French at all times, and so that probably limited even some of my contact with Americans. But
yeah, okay. So when things start to kick off, then can you talk me through how you started to realize something significant was happening?
Well, we could no longer go to classes, and in pragmatic fashion, everyone was worried about how they were going to get credit for anything they'd been doing all year. We had been planning, we being my roommate, who was also a Wellesley student, and myself had been planning to travel that summer in Europe using a U-Rail pass. And as you know, U-Rail passes could only be purchased, or you may know, could only be purchased in the United States. They couldn't be purchased abroad. And so when the mail system, there was no mail, and there was no way to contact the US to ask them. And I remember Madame de Hautefort making the phone call to try to get to one of our parents to have the U-Rail passes sent to a friend in Geneva. She dropped the de from her name. Talking to the operator, she thought, because she thought there was going to be a revolution. I mean, when de Gaulle disappeared, they were terrified. She and her close friends who were Gaullists, who really thought there was going to be a revolution, and he was going to bring in, I don't know, the army from Baden-Baden or wherever it was at the time. So that was the one funny moment. When the strike started, and I'm not sure at the time that I really understood the significance. That's when I think it's, at first it was fun. Okay, we'll go out and we'll hitchhike to, you know, to get down to the Quartier Latin. But when the garbage started piling up and when there was nothing to do, when the theater stopped, and to be honest, I think I was just a bit spoiled, and at some point thought, okay, enough. If this is boring now, I must confess that I think I probably felt at the time.
And did you get involved in any way? Did you attend any of the meetings in the Sorbonne?
I tried desperately hard to hear Sartre at the day he spoke at the Sorbonne, but it was absolutely packed. I mean, there was no way to get anywhere near him. Two of the students on the Sweetbriar program were inadvertently arrested one night. I say inadvertently, I mean, they were at a demonstration, but they had not meant to be really doing anything. And then the warnings to us all to be very, very careful and not get involved were very strong. So no, I didn't. I mostly read papers, talked to the family, talked to friends.
And you mentioned there that the particular family you were with, being a Gaullist family, were quite fearful that a revolution was coming. Was there a real sense that something significant was happening, more generally?
More generally, clearly, from listening to them talk to their friends, they were fearful that something was going to happen. And for them, in any case, the loss of de Gaulle would have been like a major disaster. They were fearful. They were frightened of the unions. Once the demonstrations turned from just the students, then there was some real fear. But I mean, meanwhile, I mean, there were barricades in Paris, as you know. I mean, the cars were being burnt. You could go out in the morning and you would see that we ripped up all the grids around the trees. And I mean, there was a sense of Paris as that something was happening. But then it ended so quickly that.
Yeah, it's
yeah.
And you've mentioned there are a number of quite significant moments, and you've mentioned one moment there that when de Gaulle disappears for a number of days. But there are other significant moments before that, like sort of the night of the barricades on the 10th of May, and then the huge demonstration on the 13th, and then other demonstrations. Were you present at any of those big moments? Can you recall being around those big moments?
Well, I recall the moments. I was not literally in any of those places, right? Yeah. So my knowledge, as long as there was television, I mean, Cohn-Bendit was everywhere in the media at that point. And I certainly remember that. I remember some of the graffiti. I mean, it's not that we didn't walk around, but not at night, and not while things were burning, and not while it was dangerous.
Okay. And was your host family worried that you were going out and taking part in all of this? Were they keeping you from going out, or? We
were both really good kids. I mean, we just weren't going to do anything that was going to upset anybody.
And what were the types of conversations that were happening in that home? Were they criticizing the students? Were they worried?
Well, you know, it's strange. I mean, that's probably the first period in which I learned that the French will support protesters even when it's seriously disrupting their lives, which is, of course, something that continues to this day and continues to amaze me at times. So there was this weird sort of sense of, well, yes, we understand that the educational system is horrible and needs to be reformed. Something needs to be done about that, but this isn't the way to go about it, I guess, would be what I was hearing. And then when the unions got involved, when the strikes got involved, when life became difficult, then there was, well, but this is always true of France, then there was less support for what was going on.
And did you feel as though as a foreign student it was more difficult for you during these difficult moments, or were you just too far away from it all to be content?
No, I really think in memory, and I even thought at the time, I thought, this is so easy for us, you know, we're gonna leave. We're going to be, you know, eventually there will be mail, eventually there will be a way out, you know, we're gonna leave. And I loved France. I mean, I knew I would come back. I guess I never thought, I don't think I ever thought France was going to stay. Well, I guess I did think the education system might improve. And when I came back a few years later, I was not at all convinced that had happened.
And did you want to leave during the events, or did you?
No, by June, we wanted to leave, but that was mostly because we were bored and we thought we were going to travel in Europe. And so we hitchhiked, my roommate and I hitchhiked out, which of course is probably not something 20-year-olds would do now, or that I would approve of, but we hitchhiked to Geneva and picked up our U-Rail passes and traveled, and then went back to Paris in just before the 14th. So I saw de Gaulle go down the Champs-Élysées that year. And he was, you know, standing in that car. I almost had the sense of something that I used to hear Madame de Hautefort and her friends say all the time. And they would sort of say, you know, you can say whatever you want to, but de Gaulle, c'est quelqu'un. You know, it was just that sense of. And there you still saw, so of course we walked around the Quartier Latin, and you saw that the grids had all been removed, and you could still see some signs of it, but Paris was sort of eerily calm by that point. It was just strangely calm.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the big debates about 1968 is the fact that, so you mentioned there how we had the student revolt, and then when the workers come on, there was maybe a sense that it was slightly different, and there's always a debate around whether or not there was a coming together of those two things, so students and workers working together. Did you ever have any experience of that, or did you see them as two separate things?
Going by my memory, I would have to say two separate things. And that was one of the that there was never a coming together for most of the students didn't even want that. I mean, I think some of the leaders would have liked to broaden the revolution, but I think for a lot of French students too, it was really about the university system.
Okay, so do you think that the majority of students were more interested in reform rather than revolution?
Yes, I do think that, of the people who are around me, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. One of the other quite stereotypical representations of this period is that somehow everybody discovered that they could speak to one another, and they describe this as the la prise de parole. And I wonder if you had any experience of that, or would you say that that's accurate?
Oh, I think that is accurate. I mean, hitchhiking through Paris, anyone would pick you up. You would talk to people you'd never talked to, people on the streets, you know, yes, I think it was, to give an analogy, it's like when you're in a long line and you start talking to people because everybody's bored and, you know, and you're mad about things. And yeah, everybody talked to everybody. And I certainly spoke to people I would never have spoken to otherwise. I would never have come into contact with. Because the French, as I'm sure you well know, don't talk to strangers. And they certainly don't smile at strangers. You know, it may have been one of the few times when, as an American, I didn't have to worry that I was smiling at the wrong time. I mean, it was like, yeah, so there was almost a carnival. It was almost like a carnivalesque kind of feeling to it. Yeah.
Now, where do you think that came from?
Where did that come from? Well, we were all in this sort of crisis together, and I think, and this may disagree with all of your research. I realize you're the historian. I'm just remembering my experience. Is that it was a crisis that everyone was going to weather. You know, there would be gas again. They would, you know, this was like a sort of bubble in French culture, in which it's almost, I don't want to say this because it's not that terrible things weren't happening, but it was almost like the bon vivant side came out of people.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So speaking of terrible things, I mean, did you experience any violence? Did you confront the police at any point? And do you think 1968 was a violent moment?
Oh, I think there was terrible brutality by the police, but no, I was not directly involved. No, my involvement with demonstrations was the following year back in the U.S. in Washington against the Vietnam War.
Okay, we can come on to that later. Another question that interests me. So was there any sense at the time, from a Paris perspective, that what was happening in Paris was happening elsewhere in France?
It was happening elsewhere in France. I mean, there were closing of usines, and the fact there were factory closings. There were, at least my memory is that there were strikes all over France. Yeah. Okay,
so you were aware of that at the time? That's not something.
But I was aware of that at the time, and I think even the fact that what was supposed to stay in Nanterre didn't was already the sense that this is spreading.
Okay.
Nanterre did not have a very good reputation at the time. I mean, nobody took it very seriously.
Why was that?
It wasn't the Sorbonne, it wasn't Paris. It was this new facility out there that no one would possibly want to take a course at. I mean, it's clearly the American 20-year-old talking.
So because it wasn't in the hub of Paris.
Yes, which is probably what allowed things to begin there, of course. But
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think that made it a perfect breeding ground for
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So beyond Paris, we have these sort of regional iterations of 1968. And we now know with hindsight and lots of research that 1968 wasn't just a French phenomenon. It was a worldwide, Europe-wide, worldwide phenomenon. Was there a sense then that this was part of something bigger than France?
Well, because of, I mean, that was the spring of Columbia in the United States. That was political assassinations. That was civil unrest. You know, I went back in August, just before the convention in Chicago, to a country that was seeing violence every night. So yes, certainly in terms of student movement, there was a strong sense that this was not just. Having said that, I have to say, I think my sense was Western Europe and the United States. I don't think I thought anything beyond that.
Yeah, and understandably so was that. Okay, can you recall what you thought of the political elite at the time? I mean, obviously de Gaulle, but also Pompidou, François Mitterrand, Pierre Mendès France, the sort of political class, and what their reaction was. What did you think of their reaction to the crisis?
I think, in all honesty, it was not until later that I was really thoroughly familiar with those names. I mean, I think at the time I wasn't paying a lot of attention, and living with the Gaullist family may have been part of that.
It was all about de Gaulle, was it?
Right, and the course I was taking at Sciences Po wasn't going to help because it was all about Hitler.
And the Gaullist family that you lived with, did they see this as an attack on de Gaulle or something else?
I don't know that they would have put it that way, but yeah, they were very fearful for de Gaulle. Yeah.
And did they resent the students for that?
Well, I think it was sort of a combination. I think on the one hand, yes, they resented the students. On the other hand, they thought there was a real problem with the universities. On the other hand, they thought de Gaulle would come in and solve all their problems, right? Because after all, he did in Algeria, right? That's ironic.
Yeah, that's true. So when the events are eventually brought to a close at the end of June, when de Gaulle wins, or the Gaullist party wins the general elections that he calls, can you remember how you felt? Was it a sense of disappointment or a sense of relief, or maybe both?
I was surprised. I was surprised. I actually didn't think. I mean, it took a while for a referendum to bring down de Gaulle, but I didn't think. I was surprised that he held on to power so clearly and so strongly. So I think it was more surprise.
But were you happy with that result, or were you?
I think I would have said at the time that I wasn't French, and because I wasn't French, and therefore I wouldn't have had an opinion.
That's very well behaved. Can you recall how your parents or your friends back home, what they thought of you being in France at this time?
Well, see, there wasn't any mail. And I mean, this was back in a time, prehistoric time, when it's before email and it's before, texting. And so the deal I had with my parents is that I would write them a letter every week. And I very faithfully wrote a letter every week and sent it off. And I remember that I sent them, as long as it was possible, I sent them news clippings and, see, we're not doing the right thing in Vietnam, and see I would do all of that. And I regret to say my mother kept all of those letters, and I threw them out at her death about 2 years ago, because now they would probably be interesting to see. The awareness in the United States that something was going on in France came quite late. And in typical with the US media, when it did come, it was blown out of all proportion, as far as I could gather from when I could talk to my parents. And so suddenly there was this, oh my goodness, my kids are in danger. And we were never in any danger.
Okay, never in any danger. So did you manage to eventually speak to your parents on the phone, or?
I did not speak to my parents until late June in Geneva.
Oh my God, how things have changed.
I know there was real freedom in those days.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the
I'm
paradox.
pretty sure I never told them how I got to Geneva.
Probably best not to know. So how did you perceive the impact of 1968 on France? I suppose at the time, so short term, and then can you reflect on perhaps what you think the impact of 1968 has been on France more long term?
Well, I don't think, I mean, it's sort of come to be called les événements, you know, and in my memory, it was much more significant than that. These were not just an incident. These weren't events. This was much more, it went much deeper than that. I went back to France. Well, since that time, I've been in France at least every other summer and often for full years during sabbatical years. The next year I was back and had any contact was my Fulbright year, which was 74. And I didn't think though I was not directly involved with the universities, I did not think a lot of progress had been made in terms of reform. I think I think eventually, you know, from advising students then in the years who were going to study to France that yeah, they're not the huge amphitheatre anymore, you know, and they do have study groups, but I don't know that the French university system is greatly different in its sense of of the authority of the professor and the place of the students and all of that. But I'm straying from what your question actually was. How do I think France changed? Well,
that's good from a university perspective, but perhaps more broadly, what impact do you think it had on France?
I'm trying to think how my personal experience affects this. The year 74, 75 is the first year my father went back to France after the World War. And so I went with him to the beaches in Normandy, and for the first time he started talking about the war. And there's an odd way, and he would keep saying, he kept looking for a France that was lost, but the France he was looking for that was lost was a rural France of you know, 1940s that wasn't there. And I think I was very focused on that. I don't know that France has changed. I mean, de Gaulle did call us for a referendum and did what the Prime Minister of Australia did most recently, right? Make it about him rather than about what the issue was. But Pompidou, I don't know that politics changed greatly during that period. To what extent that helped eventually Mitterrand be elected, I don't know. I was in Paris then too, and there I was out celebrating that evening. I'm not getting it. You ask me the question again. How broadly did that affect France?
Well, I mean, the question kind of is, you know, the fact that we still talk about 1968 almost 50 years later means that it's left some sort of mark on France, and it's got to be more than just a student revolt. You know, it's a moment that changes France to a certain extent. I just wondered if you had any reflections on what those changes have been.
I don't know if it's so much, my thought would be so much a change as a sort of continuation, that there will be demonstrations, that the French will support them until it becomes uncomfortable, and then they'll still kind of support them. That the French will go through periods of malaise, and normally when everything's going wonderfully, you know, when there isn't any problem. That reforming the educational system is a huge problem that every minister of education will have to deal with. I guess I will say the other thing I learned in '68 was how powerful the unions were, and I don't think I knew at the time what their actual membership was. I mean, now I do know that it's actually smaller than in the US, where they're not at all powerful, and yet there's still a real presence in France. I met my first card-carrying communist 2 years ago, so I know that even they are still out there. I mean, one knew who Marché was. You knew, I mean, there was a kind of presence, but I still think, I mean, I don't know, it's hard for me to, France is actually doing primaries as if they took everything bad from the US and tried to put it into effect. But other than that, just I hope they don't change their election system, but just still how many parties there are, how many candidates there are. Again, I'm drifting from this, but certain things are more constants, I think, than changes. In the US, I became a professor of French, but by that time, May '68 was lost in US memory within moments. And admittedly, there were other youth movements to focus on.
Do you think that your experience of 1968 impacted or had or inflected your understanding of France?
It's hard for me to separate, but it certainly played a role into my being politicized that year, which then did carry through once I came back to the United States, to a country being ripped apart by riots in the suburbs and a bad election and all of that. France itself had huge impact. I mean, it became my professional life. It became Paris is still the place I most feel at home. In a sense, I feel like, because I didn't have a home perhaps, but like I'm coming home every time I come back to Paris. I can't separate, and May '68 was part of that, and so I can't, because I had no other experience with France till that point. I sort of can't separate out how much was May '68 and how much was just a year in France.
Okay.
It included that.
Yeah. Can you develop a little bit how it impacted you personally and politically, and maybe explain how you brought some of those ideas with you? Or
I went back in then late July, and my parents at the time were living in Minneapolis. And even in Minneapolis, if you know the States at all, it's not known for radical activity. Excuse me, but there were demonstrations and there was civil unrest. I watched the Democratic convention on television. That was the first presidential election, in which I was going to be able to vote. I went back to Wellesley. I graduated from Wellesley in '69, so Hillary Clinton was in my class. So I knew Hillary Clinton. And that's still actually sad right now, but I did do a lot of active protest against the Vietnam War that year.
And do you think your experience in '68 had an influence on that?
I think it probably did. I think my only hesitation, and I'll sound like an academic, is because I wasn't in the US in '67, '68. It might have been the same thing had I been there. But yeah, certainly that was my experience that I had with students actively demonstrating.
And on a personal level, do you think it had any impact? So leaving politics to one side, did it change you personally? Did you change your person?
Well, I don't know if you can leave politics, because I came from a Republican family and I've been a lifelong Democrat. And it certainly started with the 1968 vote and arguing with my father about Vietnam. Personally, I mean, I'm sure from your own students, a year on your own in a country, particularly at that time when you're totally independent. I mean, I became an adult that year, and clearly gained in confidence and knowledge and all of the things that one does. That I think is much harder for our students now, with their ability to text their mothers every 3 minutes. And yeah, we were lucky. I was lucky.
Yeah, me too. Do you think that your experience in 1968 had any bearing on your scholarship or your career trajectory?
That's probably the year that I also taught film for many years, and that's probably the year. I mean, I remember going to see Godard's La Chinoise and like understanding virtually nothing, even the second time through, but going to see it with French friends, in fact, who thought it was brilliant. And anyway, that probably began my interest in film, which I ended up teaching. I never, and I am a Vingtienniste. I mean, 20th century novel was my field in graduate school. I could never figure out a way to teach May '68 because except as an aside, it just didn't somehow function. There was What anniversary are we up to? You must be working on the 50th anniversary, right? I know at the time of the 40th anniversary, there were courses at Grinnell, some other schools in the US, and I gave the materials I had that I kept a Becky Mach and some things from that period to other professors who were able to teach it. I never did.
Do you know how you would teach it now?
How I would teach it now? Was that the question? Yeah. I would do a whole lot of reading before I would begin to teach it now. No, because I assume part of what you're interested in is memory, so I didn't try to. I think the only book I've ever read on May 68 is Singer's book.
Daniel Singer.
Daniel Singer's, which was written very soon afterwards.
I think it's called A Prelude to a Revolution.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's it.
Very good. Do you think we should teach it?
Well, yes, in the same way that I think we should still be teaching the Vietnam War in the U.S. Yes, yeah, I think we should.
Have you kept an eye on, or are you aware of the way in which the story of 1968 has been told over the years in France or elsewhere? Not well enough to actually answer that question, but I think it's been taught in a way which is conflicting. I mean, I think there are the accounts of those. I'm trying to think. Cohn-Bendit has sort of altered his view of late and become a part of the establishment, but would still see that as, I think, enormously significant. I actually can't speak to how it's been taught in terms of the social unrest of that period. But I think there's certainly been, in part, a movement to say, oh, it was just a kind of blip and it didn't really have any major significance, I think. And then other people who would have a very different view. What's your view?
Pardon?
What would your view be?
Oh, that it did have an important that did have an important significance, that it ultimately did bring down de Gaulle, even if that wasn't directly connected to that it did lead into eventually Mitterrand being elected, that it had. I'm just not qualified to be able to fill in all the steps there, but.
That's fine. So I'm just going to ask you one more thing, and I've asked everybody if they were given 30 seconds to summarize their experience of 1968, how would they do it?
Of May 68 or 68?
Of your experience of May 68.
Okay. Dickens would say it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I think that as an American student, there was a part of it that it was this great experience that I was privileged to have, and privileged is an odd word, but I think that's what I felt, that I was part of what certainly seemed at the time like a social, a moment of social upheaval that I was very glad to have experienced, that gave me a very different perspective on France.